got a hard job, and I see you doing it with a lot of commitment. Thank you very much for that. I'm concerned about climate change, and I was happy to see that in the recent tax reform bill and in the spending bill that just came out that the credits for wind and solar were preserved, also for geothermal. So thank you for being part of that. I just wanted to hear what you have to say about what more can be done to promote renewables. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here. The prices of both wind and solar are dropping a lot. There's potential for new technology in nuclear as well, which is also a carbon-free technology. I'm wondering what the government can do to speed this along and promote these things.
Well, the answer to that is research, because in Europe, which has had cap and trade, it hasn't worked, and their emissions have gone up. Whereas we have used research and market forces, and our emissions have gone down on that. And if you have something like cap and trade, you don't reduce total emissions. You end up spreading them out from high emission areas to low emission areas. But there isn't a way that a country or a state or a city can keep the emissions within their boundaries. The atmosphere doesn't work that way. So I've always been a supporter of tax credits. I have always been a supporter of adequate research, particularly high-risk basic research by the Department of Energy and other agencies. I am not for throwing taxpayer money into applied research, because applied research is usually the commercialization of successful basic research. The basic research is frequently too risky for the private sector to prudently invest their money in, so let the government take care of that. They end up underwriting the failures, because usually in research there are more failures than successes, and it's a process of elimination. But when agencies like the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy end up finding out something that works, then let the private sector commercialize it and go and sell it. Now, the second point I want to make, is that we have to be very aggressive in protecting the intellectual property rights of American inventors. The Chinese and the Indians are the two worst offenders of pirating American intellectual property rights. And what they do is they don't put any of their money into research and development. They go and pirate that has been paid for by people in other countries or the governments of other countries. And then they use their manufacturing capability that pays slave labor wages to go out and undersell, practically everything that we attempt to do. And this is one of the disputes that we are having on trade with China on solar panels, because they've used everybody else's research to make their own solar panels. There has been a government subsidy in exporting below-cost solar panels, and that has been a violation of trade laws, ever since the end of the Second World War. So, I do think the president has done the right thing, because that is one way that we can cut down on other countries benefiting from pirating our inventors' intellectual property rights. Is it Dan Shalfa?
Actually, Don Schaefer.
Don Schaefer.
I'm the handwriting is bad.
Sorry about that, yeah.
Congressman, thanks for coming to these meetings. On the issue of global warming, would you say where you stand from, on one hand, total hoax to very serious issue?
In the middle.
In the middle. So you would think it may be occurring. Do you think it's man-made, or it might not exist?
Well, there is a scientific consensus, which I accept, that it's man-made. There is no scientific consensus whatsoever on how much of the cause of climate change is man-made. I'm here to tell you that it is not 0% and it's not 100%. In terms of what our response is, I look at a couple of things. One is does an unequal application of whatever international agreement there is disadvantage the United States. And that's why both Kyoto and Paris are flawed, in my opinion. Secondly, are there proper credits that are given to countries that do a vigorous job of reforestation? Because that's the way you can naturally, sop up greenhouse gases, and it's necessary for growth. That's kind of basic biology. And the two countries in the world that aggressively reforest are the United States and Canada. You see very little of that in Europe. You see none of that in Japan. And, the climate in places like Australia is not very conducive over most of the country where you can plant forests and have rainforests. And along with that, we ought to stop the massive cutting down of rainforests in places like Brazil. The third thing, is that I think anything that is done either by us unilaterally or on a multilateral and international basis is something that has to be fair to the United States and something that will work, rather than something that looks real good on a bumper sticker or on a 30-second ad on TV or things like that. And unfortunately, where I think this whole debate went off on the wrong track was back in 1995 when the UN had one of these conferences of the parties in Berlin. And at that time, the American negotiator was a former United States Senator from Colorado named Tim Wirth. And he went along with basically giving the third world, a complete get-out-of-jail-free card, and they could continue increasing their emissions, at will. And China and India have been two of the worst offenders in that. And then, for reasons that were completely extraneous to the whole issue, they gave the European Union, a lower greenhouse gas emission reduction goal than they gave to other countries like the US, Japan, and Canada, and Australia. And that wasn't very fair, at all. And it was basically due to the fact that the Rio Treaty uses the baseline as 1990. This was in 1995. Communism collapsed after 1990. And all of those Stalinist era factories in the East Germany and the former communist bloc, ended up being shut down because they were dangerous. They belched emissions, right and left, and they were uneconomical. So, after the communist governments left and there were democratic governments that were, elected in the former Soviet satellite countries, the bad plants ended up being closed down. So they had a lower baseline to begin with, because of something that happened on the geopolitical stage, meaning the communists, no longer protected their belching plants on this. So, it's a complicated issue, and unfortunately, particularly as a result of the agreement that was made in Berlin, you had countries like China, which arguably could have been a third world country then but isn't now, and India, which falls kind of in the same area, on that, taking advantage of what has happened. And they have been singularly resistant to having any type of caps being put on their growth in the near and medium term. And one of my objections to the Paris Accord is that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from 28 to 26% from 2005, whereas China does not even have to slow down their increase in 2030. That's not fair to us. So you've got to have something that's uniform across the globe. So you can't have countries like China and India, basically ignore that, and they emit more greenhouse gases now than we do.
So, another question. Do you accept most scientists' prediction that there's going to be a rise in sea level of between 4 and 5 feet? I think I said
No.
by 2050. You don't.
No. And, some of the same scientists back in the late 70s were saying we were going into a new ice age.
That was like 40, almost 50 years ago.
Yeah, but it was the same scientists. Yeah, was a NASA scientist,
you
yeah.
don't- in general, you would say there's probably not gonna be, you don't believe there's gonna be severe consequences of.
Well, a rise of 4 to 5 feet in sea level, no, I don't believe that. I think that's scare tactics.
They claim that's a conservative estimate, actually.
I think that's scare tactics.
Duly noted.
Thank you, sir.
People would have thought 50 inches of rain in 2 days would scare tactics too until that happened.
Dr. Cohen, you will be recognized in due course.